Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dave Deptula, Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and welcome to the rollout of the Mitchell Institute's latest policy paper. With President Trump's defense team headed to the Pentagon, it's crucial to recognize that the nation is at an inflection point. U.S. deterrence is wavering. China and Russia's military modernization and aggression, coupled with Iran's terrorism and pursuit of nuclear weapons, reflect critical gaps in America's military. To deter assaults on U.S. vital interests, adversaries must never question the U.S. military. However, declining funding for our military, lack of clear foreign policy, and national security organizational challenges have eroded the viability and credibility, capacity, and capability of the U.S. military. Let's face it, a new vision is required given the current national security environment. Now, in 1950, National Security Council, or NSC, document 68 called for the United States to dramatically increase its military, economic, and political power. Today, we need an NSC-68 level of reform that guides whole of government action to avert a third World War. To present the flight plan necessary for effective defense reform, let me now introduce the three authors of the paper, A Call for a New NSC-68 and Goldwater-Nichols Reform. First, welcome to General T. Michael Mosley, our 18th Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. Next, Dr. Richard Andres, a professor at the National War College and senior fellow, non-resident fellow here at the Mitchell Institute. And finally, our own Major General Larry Stutzriem, the Mitchell Institute's Director of Research. So Rich, why don't you start this off by giving us a quick summary of the effort? So over to you.
Thank you very much. Hey, General Deptula, thank you for the opportunity to use your forum this morning. It's really a privilege to speak here at Mitchell. My co-authors, General Mosley and General Stutzriem, and I, we spent a lot of time on this research. We spent about a year, frankly, working on this. And so we're really happy to have the opportunity to be able to share this with you and with the audience here. And we're looking forward to a great discussion afterwards. Okay. I don't think it's going to come as a surprise to anyone in this forum when I say the United States is facing one of its most dangerous moments since President Truman's team drafted NSC-68 in 1950. And at that point, it was under the looming Soviet threat. But the thing is, this isn't just our assessment. This is what the Bipartisan Congressional Commission on the National Defense Strategy found last year. And it's what you're going to find in the pages of virtually every major newspaper and journal that you look at any given day. The deterrence system that safeguarded American security for 75 years is failing. And it's failing for a simple reason. Our military no longer possesses the capability or the capacity to uphold our security commitments. And if deterrence collapses, we aren't just looking at heightened tensions, we're looking at the real possibility of a great power war with China. So we all recognize the gravity of the situation, and yet for the past few years, there just hasn't been any clear consensus on either what is at the root of the problem or what to do about it. But make no mistake, if our deterrent commitments exceed our deterrent capabilities for too long, eventually war is going to come. All right, so as we work together to unravel the root causes for our current challenges, we turn to the written testimony and thoughts of a host of senior leaders, chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, service chiefs, political appointees, and ironically, even one of the architects of the original Goldwater-Nichols Act. And what we found was, it was surprising. Despite all the good Goldwater-Nichols did, its unintended consequences are at the heart of the challenges we face today in defense. So when it was enacted in 1986, Goldwater-Nichols was a necessary and even overdue reform because it tackled the problems of inter-service rivalry and strengthen joint operations. And it did this by things like removing the service chiefs from the chain of command. It empowered regional combatant commanders. It established a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as the principal military advisor to the president. But as with all real-world policies, it came with unintended consequences. And the most profound of these was that with the service chiefs sidelined, no one in the chain of command had both the authority and the incentive to focus on long-term defense planning, the kind you need to deter Russia and China. The combatant commanders couldn't do it. They were consumed with current operations within their specific regions, and the chairman couldn't do it. Goldwater-Nichols left the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff outside of the chain of command. And the result was a critical gap in strategic leadership. And that gap left us unprepared to effectively deter peer adversaries like Russia and China. So as a result of these flaws in Goldwater-Nichols, the Department of Defense has developed three critical dysfunctions. And we're going to spend a lot of time on these today, but three critical dysfunctions that make it nearly impossible to build a military capable of accomplishing the deterrence mission. So the first and the most insidious is systemic paralysis. When Goldwater-Nichols was first enacted, the system that it replaced was imperfect, but at least it was competitive. The services competed with each other for resources, ideas, and operational concepts, and there were over 100 major defense firms, I said 100, competing to develop cutting-edge capabilities. But as Goldwater-Nichols evolved, it systematically eliminated competition in favor of a centralized secretariat that viewed competition not as an engine of innovation, but as a problem that had to be managed. And one of the first moves was driving the consolidation of the defense industry from over 100 firms to just 5. Many of you are probably familiar with the infamous Last Supper, where this consolidation was orchestrated, but the result was a slow, risk-averse, bureaucratic procurement system that prioritizes process over progress. So process over progress. It used to take about 3 years under the old system to develop a major new weapon system. It now takes 3 decades. Meanwhile, Silicon Valley is, conservatively speaking, a decade ahead of the Department of Defense in technological innovation. And the worst part of this is that China is closing the gap, and in some areas, their military technology is already outpacing ours. So this is the first dysfunction. Unless we address it, we're going to continue to field yesterday's weapons. All right, the second dysfunction that we uncovered is that the system prioritizes short-term goals over long-term threats. And this is really key. It wasn't always this way. The service chiefs once played a crucial role in balancing the immediate operational needs of the service with long-term force development. But under the current system, they can't. They've been structurally removed from the process. Now, combatant commanders, for their part, are entirely focused on today's fights, as they must be. Their responsibility is to manage ongoing operations in their respective theaters, not to chart the long-term trajectory of U.S. military power. And perhaps the most glaring example of this short-term mindset is the Department of Defense's perpetual fear of next war-itis. So time and again, we've seen DoD prioritize nation building and counterinsurgency over the hard realities of great power deterrence, as if preparing for the next war were somehow a distraction from today's conflicts rather than the central purpose of military strategy. And deterring great power war is the central purpose of U.S. strategy, and we got to go back and remember that. But this failure to think and plan for the long term is why we find ourselves in the current predicament today. All right, the third dysfunction that we uncovered is fragmented strategic decision-making. It's a breakdown in coordination that leaves us lurching from one crisis to the next instead of executing a coherent long-term strategy. So in the world envisioned by Goldwater-Nichols, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff would serve as a vital link between the short-term operational priorities of the combatant commands and the long-term force development necessary to sustain deterrence against a peer adversary. The chairman, according to Goldwater-Nichols, should be the one ensuring that today's fights don't come at the expense of tomorrow's security. But in practice, that's not how the system really works. Because the chairman is not in the chain of command, the Department of Defense routinely sidelines his strategic advice in favor of the crisis of the moment. Decision-making is driven by immediate operational pressures and not by a coherent plan for long-term deterrence. And this is something that we got testimony from a lot of former chairmen saying exactly this. But this isn't just our assessment, right? I mean, this is the way that a lot of leaders, both in the military and in the Office of Secretary of Defense, have described this problem for a long time. But strategic decision-making is fragmented. All right. We're not the first to identify this problem. Since 2015, at least, a succession of secretaries of defense and chairmen of joint chiefs of staff have tried to reorient the U.S. military toward great power competition. They've been trying to refocus our efforts on deterring Russia and China. But what's been going on is every time these efforts have run headlong into the same structural roadblocks. In 2015, the third offset strategy attempted to solve the problem with China and Russia by prioritizing advanced technology as a means of regaining military advantage. But it failed. It failed not because the ideas were flawed, they're right. It's because even the Secretary of Defense couldn't overcome the bureaucratic inertia backed into the Goldwater-Nichols system as it's evolved over 40 years. Then in 2018, we tried to fix the problem again. In 2018, the Trump administration developed a national defense strategy that focused like a laser beam on China, which was absolutely appropriate. It embraced a one-war force model, but first, the Goldwater-Nichols Act-driven bureaucracy smothered its reforms. They just smothered it. And then, as we deprioritized Russia and Iran, those countries took full advantage. Russia invaded Ukraine. Iran expanded its aggression against and all across the Middle East. The problem isn't that we don't know what needs to be done. We've tried a couple of times. They're good ideas. The problem is that the system prevents us from doing it. All right, all of this has led to a full-blown security crisis, one that our adversaries have been exploiting. They've realized that we are often reluctant, and we're often reluctant to admit that we no longer have the forces to back our commitments. It's no accident that at this moment, all three of our major adversaries, China, Russia, and Iran, are aggressively attacking our friends and allies. They've assessed our weakness, recognized the gaps in our deterrent posture, and are moving to reshape the global order in their favor. So the obvious next question is what will happen if our deterrence commitments continue to exceed our military capability? And we assess there's two likely scenarios. The first is that we continue to do what we've been doing for the last few years. When our adversaries attack our friends, we back down. If we do so often enough, our deterrence credibility will eventually collapse, and the rules-based international order will begin to unravel, even more than it already is. And this is going to lead to increased global instability. And this is, by the way, a lot like what happened before World War I and World War II. But the other possibility is that we don't back down. Given China's growing doubts about our military readiness, eventually this is going to lead to a great power war with China, and it's not 100% clear who's going to win that war. Those are the two scenarios we came up with. All right, so based on this, we came up with 4 recommendations. The first recommendation is that we conduct a comprehensive national security reassessment comparable to what Truman did with NSC-68 in 1950. This review needs to recognize that our deterrence failures are occurring and increasing and work to ensure that our military commitments match our military capabilities. So a new NSC-68 review. Our second recommendation is to restructure the Department of Defense. The key to this, to restructuring this, is to restructure authority and incentives to balance our short and long-term thinking and to fix the over-centralization of OSD that's creating vast bureaucratic inefficiencies. Our third recommendation is to increase the defense budget to align with current security needs. This is important. What I'm going to say next is, while we don't believe that increasing the defense budget will do much good unless we first fix the structural problems that I was just talking about, in the long term, no amount of restructuring is going to give us the capacity to deter China unless we significantly boost defense spending. So our final recommendation is to shift investment toward cost-effective warfighting capabilities. To do this, we need to implement a cost per effect analysis to guide spending and procurement. We need to avoid legacy-driven funding and prioritize capabilities that enhance deterrence. We need to conduct a rules and missions review to determine the most effective service investments. And we need to redirect resources to high-end warfare capabilities, and that means naval, air, and space. All right, so in conclusion, the window for action, the opportunity to act on this is closing. If we do not rebuild our capability to deter our adversaries, there are only two likely outcomes. The first is gradual strategic defeat as our deterrent threats gradually collapse, and the second is a war with China when they eventually call our bluff. And if we stay on the road we're on right now long enough, they will call our bluff. Thank you. Look forward to your questions.
Well, hey, thanks, Rich, for that great rundown of the paper's main points. So now let's dive into some questions and get the conversation going. Before we talk about the mammoth scope of the undertaking that we're proposing, let's discuss more about the why. The paper, as you reviewed, presents reform not just as a nice to do, but an imperative for securing U.S. vital interests. From your vantage points, each of you, why does the new administration need the clarity about the state of the military that they're inheriting? Chief Mosley, why don't you kick off this question?
Yeah, Dave, thank you. Dr. Andres, thank you too. I think if we listened yesterday to a new administration's view of the world that we're living in, I think it becomes very clear that there is a need for reform in almost a ways, means, and ends discussion about how do we get to where the new president was talking. If we want the American military to be capable enough to be able to persuade or dissuade or deter, and if required to fight, then we're not set for that right now. We've languished a bit under lack of resourcing, lack of prioritization, and we need to think through the world we live in right now is a bit different than it has been, and we're going to get more detailed in that. But you have a Russia that's engaged in land warfare in Europe. You have a China that's a very assertive entity in the Western Pacific and East Asia. You have Iran, who's been resourcing surrogates and effectively at war with the state of Israel and the West. You have the North Koreans that are providing logistics supply and personnel to fight in Europe. And I've been a bit of a broken record on the other piece of this that not too many people have begun to recognize until recently, is the transnational criminal activities that are causing equal serious threat and assessment discussions with the American military. In fact, the new president mentioned that yesterday. So in the old days, we had the Soviet Union. Now we have Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and transnational criminal activities. So the need for reform to get at capabilities and capacities, it couldn't be more critical right now. So Dave, I think we're going to have a rich discussion here on what does that mean and how do we get there. But the world we're living in right now is not the world we lived in 25 or 30 years ago or 40 years ago. It's a completely different animal. When you look at whether you think through an operational template or a strategic operating domain, you have air, land, space, cyber, and maritime. Are we able to dominate each of those operating domains? And if we're not, should we not consider why? And the strategic commons of international airspace, space, cyber, and maritime, are we able to dominate, to persuade, to dissuade across those strategic commons? If we're not, shouldn't we have a discussion about that? So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I think as I look out, we need to reset ourselves, specifically the Navy and the Air Force, and the resourcing of being able to get out and be able to persuade and dissuade, I think is critical right now. So let me step back just a bit and we'll go from there.
Okay, Stutz or Doc, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, let me jump in real quick. Thumbs up on everything General Mosley said, but let me take it from a different perspective. As the chief talked about the complex threats that have developed, turn it around and look at evidence of our inability to deter or dissuade bad behavior. You've got the Russians exploiting, working on the borders of NATO. You got China's outrageous behavior, open declaration of changing the world order. You have the boldness of Seventh Front War against the Israelis, and despite a very successful attack on Iran, their tentacles are once again, they're trying to maintain their hold of the Middle East. And then you have the boldness of the Houthis and the other, transnational piece that General Mosley talked about. So we are not deterring much in this world today, as we see a China racing to develop its nuclear capability, expanding its ability to force project. And one of the main focuses of Mitchell this year has been Arctic security, and very little understood about how vulnerable the homeland is to threats that emanate from or through the Arctic. You would think that because our national defense strategy says homeland defense is the top priority of that strategy, there'd be adequate resources and attention and priorities paid to reshaping what we have in terms of capabilities in the Arctic, and they are very abysmal. And so I get back to what Rich, summarized in his papers, is the Goldwater-Nichols dynamics that have developed keep the Defense Department focused on the near term. And those are 30 years of non-combat missions, counter-terror missions, counterinsurgency operations, in permissive threat environments. And that's a problem. We've got to fix this with very, very significant reform, which the majority of the bureaucracy will resist.
Thanks for that, Stutz. Rich, a big part of NSC-68 success was combining long strategic vision with adequate resources and political will. What foundational pillars does a 21st century NSC-68 need to enable the United States to avoid conflict with a peer adversary?
Hey, the most important thing, the critical thing, is that we have to take a clear-eyed look at the balance between our commitments around the world, our defense commitments, our deterrence commitments, and our capabilities. And that is the absolute center of what we need to do with a new NSC-68 type of reform. Back in 1950, this is what occurred. The Truman administration looked out, and we had really, really hoped that after World War II, we could shrink our military budget, take a peace dividend, and everyone is just going to get along. But the Soviet Union had a different view of this. They did not believe that was the case. And in 1950, what we did is we looked and tried to balance what was going on in the world with our capability, and we realized that we did not have the military we needed to get the job done. And back then, what we realized is that this was also the cause, or one of the major causes, for both World War I and World War II. And that is that we did not have the capability to deter aggression. And so in 1950, we made the call to increase our military spending to get up to the level where we could deter World War III. And that's the first thing we have to do. We've been living in this very comfortable world for a long time where we're pretending it's still in the 1990s. We're pretending we don't have pure adversaries capable of doing what they want to do. But we no longer have this. So recognizing that is the first step. We've got to change the mindset. There are a lot of people right now across the bureaucracy. There's a lot of people in government and in industry that benefit from the current system. It's comfortable. So we've got to change the mindset in such a way that people realize that this is now about life and death, and it's about the potential of going to a war with China. It's about a third world war. So that mindset's critical. But all of this is fine and good, but if we don't change the actual authority and incentives, the whole thing is not going to work. So we've got to get into the process, into the bureaucracy, and we've got to put people in positions where they can make a difference and also have an incentive to make a difference in great power competition and great power deterrence. So those are three things: recognize what's going on, change the mindset, but then you've got to change the bureaucratic system and incentive structure.
Yeah, and as we all know, that's not going to be an easy thing to do, but the value of the paper you all have written is at least it will elevate the discussion so that the new folks in the Department of Defense will at least become aware of it. Chief, let's talk about resources for a minute. Our defense budget is at historic lows relative to gross domestic product. But I think we all know just throwing more money at each of the services in equal amounts certainly won't solve the problem, probably just make it worse. So could you walk us through the specific changes we need and how DoD allocates resources to better align spending with our resource or with our strategic priorities?
Dave, that is an unbelievably timely question. The baseline percentage of GDP for the Defense Department now is hovering right at 3. When you factor inflationary rates and et cetera in there, you're actually slightly below 3. And so I used to testify that we need a floor. The service chiefs, the service departments need a floor. And at the time we were testifying it needed to be somewhere around 4, if not 5%. But that was a long time ago. The beauty of a floor also gets you around the notion of supplementals, of contingency funding, because all of that has historically come out of the cuts that each of the services gets. But if you look at the historic cuts of the budget, the Air Force unfortunately has a pass-through account that takes a big wedge out of your overall allotments of funding for investment. The Navy and the Air Force took the biggest hits toward the end of the Bush administration into the beginning of the Obama administration to pay for ongoing activities in Afghanistan and Iraq. We effectively, Air Force and Navy, were forced to eat our own seed corn as far as the investment accounts. So Dave, I would say the floor now should be somewhere around 5.5 or 6, because you've got to make up the lost time of the investments that you did not make. Let me sound a bit parochial right now. The acquisition priorities at the time were a tanker, a combat search and rescue helicopter, the F-35, space systems, and a bomber that assumed that the C-130, the C-17 mods, and the F-22 would continue. All of those assumptions proved not to hold. So our tanker is still not fixed. And I would question anybody on the call that thinks it's a good idea to put people in combat in a flying machine that was built in the Eisenhower administration. But that's a different question. So we have to catch up. We also used to testify, all of the service chiefs used to testify that if we're not careful, if we continue to delay these programs that are required for obsolete systems and systems that are going out of service life, you're going to eventually reach a point that the only way out of this is to buy your way out of it, and it's going to be more expensive. I would suggest that we're probably there right now in the Air Force. We've got a trainer that was built in the late 50s and early 60s. We've got tankers. Our fighter force is aging rapidly. We continue to discuss whether we need to replace a fighter or not while our opponents are fielding multiple systems. I think the budget piece of this, Dave, is very critical. I think it's 5.5 or 6% of GDP, but with a big, all in capital letters. Unless you get at the systemic problems within the department, it's like a very large bucket with holes in the bottom of it. You could fill that up with all the money in the world, but before you invest it in a new destroyer or a new submarine or a new aircraft, you're leaking out the bottom with the budget because of the bureaucracy and the organizational failures. You need to fix the structure, acquisition, contracting, planning, long-range planning, et cetera, and then address the money. Otherwise, you're just going to waste the money and you're not going to get anywhere. So it is in my view, it is a vision of a Goldwater. It is a vision of something that looks like NSC-68 that takes the United States national security team to a whole of government approach that includes not just defense, but commerce, treasury, homeland security, justice, et cetera. And then you back that up with a change of the bureaucracy and get at this massive amount of waste and drag. I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here, but who are all of those bureaucracies within the building and what value are they? Who worries about tomorrow's fight? I was the guy accused of next war-itis. Guilty. I still have next war-itis. Absolute guilty. You have to fight today's fight, but you've got to prepare for tomorrow. And that's where that budget comes. But without that acquisition piece and that bureaucratic piece, it seems to me we're gonna waste money and not get there. So that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Chief. I can't help but, as you're talking, share with you just a short story that Rich, I think, already kind of addressed in the context of the average citizenry not understanding the seriousness of the problem. So last week I had a doctor's appointment, and when I met my doctor, she told me that she'd listened to a podcast that we did in December where we went through the description of the Air Force being the oldest, smallest, and least ready in its history. And she told me she was shocked. And then she kind of quoted back to me my explanation of the $45 billion in pass-through and the negative impact that it's had on properly resourcing the Air Force. And she went through examples of the shocking geriatric age of our aircraft and told me that she was absolutely flabbergasted that the Air Force was in that condition. And she told me that, look, I thought we had the strongest and most modern Air Force in the world. And then she quoted the stats that the Air Force was funded less than the Army and the Navy for 30 years in a row. I would add the Army post 9/11, 20 years, had an average of $65 billion a year more than the Air Force. And I was amazed at the impact that those facts had on her. The average American citizenry is simply not aware of just how seriously our Air Force has declined. We just have to keep on repeating that message. But let's move on.
Boss, we need a culture within the service that's willing to advocate, to speak truth to the public and to Congress about the need to modernize the Air Force.
Thank you, Stutz.
Yeah, Dave,
that's absolutely spot on.
Dave, let me put my joint hat on for a minute and say it's the Air Force for sure, because we're very aware of the details of the Air Force's aging systems, obsolescence, et cetera. But there's another piece of this too. When bad people wake up in the world, I would suggest that the two things they worry about the most is the American Air Force and the American Navy. And I would say the Navy is in not too distant a problem set than we are. The Navy needs to be building surface combatants. The Navy needs to be building ships. The Navy needs to be building submarines. The Navy's job is to control blue water. Our job is to control air and space. They're not too distant from us as far as budget and about the penalties that they paid when we went down the road of fighting a short-term fight at the expense of long-term planning and execution. I would say one advantage the Navy has, and everybody on this call, I'm willing to take the slings and arrows of abuse, but the Navy has a benefit of their long-term shipbuilding accounts that they can effectively amortize long lead items, effectively multi-years on big expenditures. The Air Force never had that when I was the chief. We had to pay up front. I always wanted the same benefit of an aerospace account to enhance the industrial base, but also to let us buy the big ticket items like the bombers and fighters, et cetera, and do that correctly with as much oversight as we can. So Dave, I'll put my joint hat on and say the Navy's in the same boat we are, and we should be very concerned not just about our Air Force, but about our Navy's ability to project force. So I'll put my Air Force hat back on now.
Yeah, no, that's great. I get you, Chief. But the Navy has a shipbuilding plan that they have very successfully advocated for on the Hill, and they're getting funding beyond the defense budget to be able to do that. And
Yeah.
as someone mentioned earlier, Stutz, Air Force leadership needs to do that. I mean, you know, if we don't get the adequate resources and we continue in the force structure nosedive that the Air Force is in, we're not going to have an Air Force in not that too distant future. So let's move on. Rich, let's talk a bit more about the unintended consequences of Goldwater-Nichols. While it was meant to enhance jointness and reduce service rivalry, your paper suggests it fundamentally changed how we make long-term strategic decisions. So how did removing service chiefs from the chain of command affect the ability to balance immediate needs versus future requirements?
Yeah. So let me back up for a moment. The problem, I'm a big fan of Goldwater-Nichols. I think it was really needed when it was passed. It was important. There was just so little cooperation between the services, so much rivalry that something had to be done. And it was coming after about 40 years after the big defense reforms that we'd done before. We do these things about every 40 years, I think. And the problem it had then was too much fragmentation. And, you know, so the solution to Goldwater-Nichols provided was to centralize things, remove the service chiefs, and try to centralize everything in the Department of Defense, Joint Staff, and OSD. And what this reminds me of is the Soviet Union in the 1930s. And the Soviet Union in the 1930s had this problem. It had all of this fragmentation in industry, and its solution, right, made all kinds of sense. Solution was to centralize everything. So they got rid of all of this private industry, all these private farms, all of this private fragmentation, and they centralized everything under one government. And on paper, it made a great deal of sense, right? We'll have good strategic planning, but it doesn't work that way. That's not how human beings work. You need competition. And so when we first, 1986, when we began this process of trying to centralize things, I think we did some good things. We helped people think more jointly. We created a generation of people who could think more jointly. But what's happened over the last 40 years is the same thing that happened with the Soviet system. And that centralization has led to this bureaucratic paralysis in which there just isn't any real competition. They try to manage things from the center of the Pentagon, and you get exactly what you would expect if you'd studied 1930s Soviet Union economic policy. The whole thing has become incapable of innovation. We can't even get people from Silicon Valley to come up here and work anymore because they're just stifled by this absolutely over-centralized process.
And I can't help but throw in, taking 15 years to develop a Frappin training aircraft? Really?
15 years. I mean, the Soviet Union collapsed under its own weight, and that's what's happening with the Department of Defense. There's no excuse. We should develop these things in about 3 years. We did this for decades in about 3 years, and now 15 years, sometimes 20 years, sometimes 30 years to develop a new weapon system. So, how do you deal with this problem? Centralization is not going to fix it. That's where everybody immediately looks at centralization. If we just had a better plan, a better strategy, that's not going to fix it. We need to decentralize things. We need to divert authority back to the service chiefs. We've got to winnow out that massive bureaucratic structure that is developed across OSD and the Joint Staff, so that we can get competition and we can get head-to-head both Department of Defense and industrial competition going again. And that's going to mean that's going to be uncomfortable, right? Nobody wants to decentralize. But if we can't do that, and we can't do it now, because with the new administration, we've got maybe a 2-year opportunity to make some big changes. And then the same people are just going to, you know what's going to happen. It's just going to continue. And if that happens, we are going to go to war. So we need to decentralize. We need to get some competition back in the system. We need to put the service chiefs back in the chain of command. We need to winnow through OSD. And I think that is going to be what we need to do in the future to begin to address the problems that we've got.
No, thanks for that. Listen, I do want to save some time for discussion and questions with our audience. So let me fire one more question off to Chief Mosley, and then we'll switch to, we'll open it up for audience Q&A. Chief, the chairman's role as principal military advisor hasn't translated into ability to drive strategic change. The current JCS system relies heavily on consensus, as Rich just laid out, and lacks clear authority for enforcing strategic priorities. What reforms would help restore proper balance between near-term operational needs and long-term strategic requirements?
Yeah, Dave, thanks. Let me put my chief of staff hat on and say the system that we have now serves none of the services well. Goldwater-Nichols took the chiefs out of the game effectively. The chiefs get to define a requirement for a ship, an airplane, a ground fighting vehicle, or whatever, but then you're under the current system, you're taken out. You don't have inputs. You cannot literally go to the meetings. You have no control over what's happening to the contracting, the acquisition system. And so whatever comes out the other end may or may not even be close to what the chief defined as a requirement going in. And so that piece needs to be fixed. The notion that the combatant commanders, and remember, a combatant commander has a 2-year billet, which can be extended. The chief is the only people that have 4-year assignments. Everyone else has a 2-year assignment, and that's for a reason, because you need to be able to deal with today's problem, and you need to be able to focus and define tomorrow's problem. And that's where we've had issues with this current template. I don't think I would have been opposed in the mid-'80s to the reforms that the authors were attempting to field, but I think the unintended consequences over time, Dr. Andrus is right. We have slipped into a world where it's a committee or it is not, it is consensus, or it is not focused on the long-term needs. I mean, look at what happened to us during Afghanistan and Iraq. We end up canceling several major programs. The F-22, for one, had been the #1 program for close to 8 chiefs of staff. But we focused on the near-term problem, the expedient problem, to the exclusion of longer-term things. That has to change. The chiefs have to be put back into the system. A great example of the bureaucracy of whatever well-intentioned it was thought to be at first is the Joint Program Office for the F-35. What does the JPO do that the Department of the Navy, the Department of the Air Force couldn't do? You know, for a while, I haven't asked lately, but for a while, I was, as the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, told I cannot talk to Lockheed or Pratt & Whitney. I have to go through the JPO. Well, who thinks that's a good idea? Where does that come from? And what is the benefit of that layer of bureaucracy? How many people are in that system, and what's the manpower cost of that bureaucracy and those people, which of course are rolled up into the total program cost of the aircraft? And a chief got nothing to say with that, because you're not asked, except when something goes wrong, who gets dragged over to the Hill to explain the process. So Dr. Andrus is right, that the system has somehow morphed into a bureaucracy that is going to be very, very aggressive in defending itself. The service chiefs need to be put back into the game of authority and put back into the game of responsibility. If you're going to drag the Marine Commandant over to the Hill to beat him up or her up about something, at least give them the benefit of being in the process. So the budget is a piece of today's world, but it is tomorrow's investment account in the fielding of tomorrow's systems. What committee or what consensus defines those tomorrow's systems? Who are those people? And where do they come from? How much combat experience do they have? How much combat exposure do they have? How many times have they been shot at? Where does this, we heard a great deal yesterday from the new president about priorities and about the focus on the United States and the focus on our place in the world. He's not going to get there with this bureaucracy that we're facing. The NSC-68 like thing will define where we're going to go, the whole of government approach. If there's a Goldwater-Nichols reform, he'll be able to get at it. So I don't want to sound bitter about the whole thing, because I'm not. It's just an observation that this could be so much cleaner and it could be so much more efficient. And since the mid-'80s, we would not end up with the oldest, smallest, and less capable Air Force in the service's history. That's a fact. That's not an emotion. That's a fact. And we need to fix that. So I'll quit banging my spoon on my high chair.
No, thanks very much, Chief, and all of you for that very important discussion. So we're going to open the session now to questions from the audience. I think all of you on the call, or at least most of you, I know the drill by now. When I call on you, unmute your mic, state your name and affiliation, and then ask your question. And we already have several questions using the Q&A function, which I will go to right off the bat because I don't see any raised hands yet. Let's start with someone everyone here on the panel is familiar with, Pete Fessler. Coach says, asks, when NSC-68 was drafted in 1950, the majority of the United States population recognized the Soviet Union as a threat. This provided the national will to support the investment needed for execution of the strategy. Today, many Americans do not view Russia or China as adversaries. How does a new national strategy address this disconnect? Anybody?
Well, let me take a shot at that for General Fessler. I think we're seeing now with activities in the Ukraine, we're seeing now with activities in the Middle East with the attacks on Israel, the attack on international shipping in the Red Sea by the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, etc. I think people are beginning to realize that there is a world out there where there are threats. Remember, the big threat that Truman was attempting to get his arms around was the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. Well, now we have multiple players with nuclear weapons. We have a China with nuclear weapons, a Russia with nuclear weapons, and Iran on a path to get a nuclear weapon, the North Koreans with a nuclear weapon. And so I think the meeting of the threat arrays now is not just one, but it's multiple threats that are coordinating and collaborating activities. That becomes very troublesome and very problematic. I think that is where we're at today, and a new NSC-68-like approach could recognize that and guide the whole of government toward solutions of those sets, so we could persuade, dissuade, deter, and if necessarily fight.
Very good. We've got a couple of raised hands. Let's go first to Teresa Hitchens. Go ahead, Teresa.
Hi, and Happy New Year, I guess. This is the first time I've been on since then. Thanks for doing this. My question is about the role of the Space Force. The first time I ever heard of anyone speaking about possibility of a new Goldwater-Nichols actually was in reference to the roles and missions of the Space Force and how the Space Force should interact with the other services now, and also with Space Command in particular, because there's an overlap there that doesn't really exist with any of the other combatant commands and services. Space Command and Space Force have the same mission areas, and so I wondered if somebody could address the issues on how your thought process about the need for a new review might impact on the current structure with regard to Space Command and the Space Force? Thank you.
Stutz, you want to take a stab at that one?
Sure. First of all, we all know that there is some retooling and maturing that's going on with respect to those relationships. But I want to get back to Goldwater-Nichols, and Doc Andrews has just done a fantastic job putting into print this research and the synthesis of what we've done. And it's a tremendous read for everybody. So I encourage that. But there are other things that happen, dynamics with respect to Goldwater-Nichols. And that was ensuring that in the war fight, there was not equivalency, not everybody playing. That's not jointness. That the task force commander is going to assemble the right capabilities based upon what is most effective for the situation at the time. However, on the staff side, and this should be very concerning for Space Force, because it's a problem for the airmen, that there isn't in the planning, in the strategy development, the same type of equal representation. To give you an example, from 2006 to 2011, the top 13 jobs in the Department of Defense, there was not one airman. There have been about 100 COCOM commanders since the start of the establishment of the Air Force in 1947. Only a handful have had airmen in command. So when you talk about the optimum use of air power and space power, that should be a primary rewickering of the use of expertise in the domain capabilities as you try to build this better future and pivot toward that peer conflict and readiness for that peer conflict. So that's kind of the main concern I would have in what our research has covered in terms of a reform of Goldwater-Nichols.
Hey, Dave, let me add a thought about space. The question was excellent. I think first off, there is a Space Force. The president decided there would be. The Air Force and Space Force are symbiotic. I've never thought of myself as a pure airman because in my time we had air and space, and we looked at the atmosphere and above the atmosphere as a continuing piece of authority, separate domains, international airspace, international space. But there's another piece here I think that's critical. Space is a very unique combat domain because you have to ascend through the atmosphere to get up there. It's not a very inexpensive place, but I think also there's a chance here with a new Key West-like discussion about the roles and the manning of the Space Force. For instance, when the Space Force was separated from the Air Force, there was also Navy space, Army space, there MDA, NRO, NGA. There are a variety of operating entities out there within DoD and the services that focus on space. The president stood up a Space Force. Where did all of those other entities go? Did they run and hide under the bed when the president and the department asked for the manpower and the authorities for space? So there is a Space Force that focuses on space. Where are those other players? Why are they not in space? The Space Force. Why is there an MDA? Why is there an NGA? Why is there an NRO? Why are all of those separate entities costing more money, creating more efficiencies and more bureaucracy? Why isn't all of that in Space Force? Simple question.
And it's an excellent question, which quite frankly was the predicate for one of the primary reasons, at least described by the former vice president or the vice president under the first Trump administration, articulated for the rationale for standing up the Space Force in the first place. Okay, I see John Turpak has been waiting patiently. John, over to you.
Yes, thanks very much. Two questions. If you're thinking about returning things, at least to some degree, to the way they were before Goldwater-Nichols, what are the safeguards you propose that wouldn't lead to something like Grenada, number one? And number two, what are the specific steps you think are needed? Does it start with legislation? Does it start with hearings? What are the steps to get us to a new version of Goldwater-Nichols?
There's no simple answer to that question. You need a James Lockyer or someone like that to really understand this. And by the way, it was really interesting reading some of his testimony that concurred with some of the things that we're proposing here. And as one of the architects of Goldwater-Nichols, it was really interesting reading his more recent testimony. How do you actually get this going? First of all, you've got to get the president to ask Congress to take action. And then you've got to get Congress to start hearings, and then you've got to get legislation, and you've got to do it quickly because we don't have a long clock on this. We've got to take action quickly. What is the actual solution? This paper does not go into the specifics of this, but we need reform, and or something completely different. But the first action is going to be a president calling on Congress. And it needs to be bipartisan. This is a bipartisan issue. We've seen a lot of the same things coming out of both sides of the political spectrum now in terms of what we need to do. So, John, I don't have a detailed roadmap for this, but I think those would be the main steps we take in that direction.
Hey, John, it's good to hear you. Let me offer you another thought along the same lines. Remember, prior to Goldwater-Nichols, we were living in the post-Southeast Asia era, and we learned so many lessons learned out of Southeast Asia. We learned about single focus of air. We learned about single focus of maritime. We learned about single focus of land, because during Southeast Asia, we had a commander-in-chief Pacific Fleet, but we had such an abrogated command authority that none of that was centralized into mission planning and execution. So there was I believe, a complete command failure out of Southeast Asia to focus on the problem. We learned so many lessons through that Southeast Asia thing, to include the Air Force with Moody, Suitor, and Red Flag, with the aggressors, with the types, with the focus on composite force training. The Army did the same at Fort Irwin. Marines at 29 Palms, and Navy. So there was a focus from the mid-70s to the mid-80s about we have to get this right. Then we had a couple of hiccups for all the wrong reasons, and we go down the road of Goldwater-Nichols. I would suggest I am less worried about the repeat of that, because we're going through another period of lessons learned off of dirt roads in Afghanistan and Iraq. We've been fighting for 34 plus years in Afghanistan and Iraq. We've not fought a near competitor. We've not fought somebody that will literally across the spectrum, maritime, airspace, cyber, Navy, that will fight us back like a peer competitor will. We've also spent now, X decades in professional military education together with Navy, Army, Marine, State Department agencies. So I'm not worried about a return to Grenada. I'm worried about being able to address the threats that face the country right now. I think we've progressed way beyond a Grenada. I think we're in a world now where we realize that the bureaucracy is an enemy no different than anybody else. I think the president makes a statement that we need to reform this, which gets into acquisition, command authorities, et cetera, into long-range planning, get rid of the committees. And then the Congress is going to have to do it. I agree with Doc Andreas. Hopefully that helps.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of this Mitchell Institute paper rollout, a call for a new NSC-68 and Goldwater-Nichols reform, which is now online at the Mitchell Institute website. I commend the participants. There are still some outstanding questions in the Q&A file. I will copy those and get them to the paper authors. And gentlemen, we can only hope that the new administration is highlighting every page of your effort. Thanks for the superb work. And from all of us at the Mitchell Institute, Have a great aerospace power kind of day.